Have you ever heard the expression, the safest place to be is in the center of God's will? That phrase was coined by Corrie ten Boom, who was a Dutch Christian imprisoned for helping Jews escape the Nazis. Now, to be clear, Corrie ten Boom never meant to suggest that somehow we are bulletproof if we are obediently following Jesus and nothing bad could ever happen to us. On the contrary, Corrie ten Boom knew what it meant to follow Jesus into dangerous circumstances and then to suffer the consequences for it. She and her family were responsible for rescuing nearly 800 Jews through an underground network of safe houses. But just after midnight on February 28, 1944, the Gestapo burst into the ten Boom house and arrested the whole family. As a result, Corrie's 84-year-old father soon died in prison. Corrie and her sister Betsy ended up in a concentration camp, and later that year, Corrie watched her beloved sister die. This from the woman who said the safest place to be is in the center of God's will. Corrie and her devout family learned that obedience to God's calling doesn't give us any kind of magical protection. In fact, the opposite is more likely to be true, that we will face trials and adversities because we're faithfully following Jesus. So here's the reality. The center of God's will may, in fact, be one of the wildest and most dangerous places you could ever imagine. So what are we to make of this expression, the safest place to be is in the center of God's will? What does that even mean? Is it even true? Well, we're going to answer that question in the message today, and we'll do that by first considering Paul's experience in Acts 21 through 23. And then we'll come back and answer that question at the end. Now, we're covering 3 chapters of Scripture, so I'm not going to be reading those, but I do invite you, if you'd like to open up your Bibles to Acts chapter 21 and follow along. We'll be beginning at verse 17. So our story picks up with Paul concluding his 3rd epic missionary journey, and he's about to arrive in Jerusalem. Now, as Scott taught last week, Paul has received some conflicting messages from God about this trip to Jerusalem because he is both compelled by the Spirit to go. The Lord is telling him to go. This is where he needs to be. But at the same time, the Spirit is giving him multiple warnings that great trouble awaits him there. And so Paul has this moment of decision. It's kind of like his Gethsemane moment. Like Jesus, he knows what God has called him to do. He knows what God's will is, but he also knows that by doing it, it's going to cost him dearly. And so Paul goes to Jerusalem. He's like Jesus. He's choosing to be faithful to what God has asked him to do and finds himself in grave danger for doing it. So let's talk about Paul in Jerusalem. Now, Paul's troubles started before he even got there. Now, when Paul arrived in Jerusalem, despite what we might think of him as this great evangelist and missionary and all this stuff, his reputation in Jerusalem was at an all-time low. You see, Jewish Christians had heard rumors that Paul was teaching Jews to abandon the law of Moses and all the Jewish customs, to turn away from their ancient traditions, what they had always kept. Now, this is untrue. Paul's gospel teachings had been misrepresented, and he's really kind of being slandered here. But that didn't change the fact that the Christians that he had come to support, they had already turned against him before he got there. Then he's going to the temple to appease some of the Jewish traditions. Paul is recognized by some Jews who were from Ephesus. Remember, Paul had been there for 3 years. He was known. And so these Jews from Ephesus who happen to be in Jerusalem, they recognize Paul. They also recognize another man from Ephesus, a Gentile who was a Christian, who was one of Paul's ministry partners, one of his ministry associates. And they assume that Paul has taken this Gentile man into the inner courts of the temple. That was a severe offense. It was punishable by death. But again, it was untrue. Paul hadn't done this. He was falsely accused. But there really wasn't a fair court system back in the day. He was immediately kind of dragged out and received a severe beating. He was on his way to being killed until he's rescued by a Roman soldier. But that soldier then immediately bound him in chains. A couple things to note here. One, this is a fulfillment of a prophecy he'd received early in Acts 21 from the prophet Agabus, who bound himself and said, Paul, this is your destiny. Well, Paul, it becomes his reality very quickly. And another thing, once Paul is bound in chains here, he's really going to be either in chains or under arrest pretty much for the rest of his life. His day as a free man moving about the empire are really over. So who would have thought that being in the center of God's will would come with a pair of handcuffs? So he's misrepresented by the church. He's falsely accused by the Jews in the temple. And on top of all that, once Paul is arrested and in chains, he is mistakenly identified, of all things, as an Egyptian terrorist who was on Rome's most wanted list. He led a band of assassins several years earlier. They were still looking for him. And because Paul was causing such a ruckus, they thought, oh, we think we caught the assassin. So, Paul cannot catch a break. The trip is starting off terribly. Now, I think it's important for us to note the degree to which Paul was misunderstood and the assumptions that were made about him are relevant to us. Because as Christians who remain faithful to Jesus, we need to expect that our faith in Jesus is to be misunderstood or to be misrepresented, and that we will face opposition for it, especially by those who do not share our beliefs. Now, why is that? Why as Christians, are we misrepresented and misunderstood? Well, it's because we have a whole different way of seeing the world. We have an entirely different concept of God and humanity. We turn to the Bible as our authority for all things, right? And others don't. We also have the Spirit who indwells in us and gives us spiritual insight and understanding that the world doesn't. And of course, let's not forget that there is an enemy who is deliberately trying to sabotage the truth of the gospel and to twist and distort our witness and our words about Jesus. And so, just like Paul in his day, where people had heard all kinds of rumors and wrong ideas about him, there are a bunch of misrepresentation and misunderstanding about Christians today. Here are some of the ones that I just came up with. That as Christians, we are anti-science and anti-intellectual. That we're a hate group because we do not support certain things that are popular in our culture. That Christians are all the same. We're no different than the crooked TV evangelist. That we are anti-women. We're against women. We're for oppressing women and pushing them down. Some misconceptions about Christianity also are that Christianity is no different than anything else. It kind of all religions kind of say the same thing. They're basically that. Another one is that the Bible is essentially just a rule book, and you have to follow it if you want to get to heaven. Some people outside the Christian faith believe that we believe in 3 gods, not one. People in other cultures and of other races have accused Christianity of being a Western white religion that promotes colonialism. Some people think if they become a Christian, then they're going to have to never have fun and just embrace suffering and misery for the rest of their life. And I think probably one of the most common ones is that people would think, well, the church, all they care about is money. All they want is your money. There was someone who connected to a person from our church, and upon being invited to church, the person said, well, how much do I have to pay to go? As if, we're selling tickets at the door. Now, these are not true. These are all false allegations and misrepresentations of the Christian faith. Now, I know we all hate to be mischaracterized, right? We don't want what we stand for in Jesus to be, twisted and distorted and perverted, and then to have to face opposition for something that isn't even true. But I want to encourage you, it's okay. It's okay. In fact, it's better than okay, because opposition is one way that God opens the doors to opportunity. Being misrepresented, being misunderstood, and being misidentified gives us a chance to speak truth. I think back several years ago when there was the whole controversy about the cross on Dewey Hill, and it became a big thing. And that allowed me, during this big public debate, to speak about Jesus Christ, and I and another pastor there were able to present the gospel and say, this is who Jesus is, and this is what we believe. And I know many in the community had an opportunity to do the same kind of thing. So this opposition, this misunderstanding actually became a great gospel sharing opportunity. Now, kind of in the same way, this opposition that Paul's facing in Jerusalem, it becomes a doorway of opportunity for him. And so Paul, once he's arrested, he asks to address the crowd. He wants to, address their misdirected ideas about him and Jesus by giving his testimony. He's going to give his testimony about Jesus. Now, if you're the kind of person who likes foreshadowing, Paul is going to give his address on the steps of the Antonia fortress. Now, you may not mean anything to you just by that, but Paul was going to be standing on the very steps Jesus stood on when he was with Pilate and Barabbas. This is the same spot where people had to decide what they thought about Jesus. And now here Paul is on the same steps talking about Jesus. So let me ask you, how do you think this is going to go? How is it going to end up? We'll get there in a minute. So Paul gives his testimony, and we read this again in Acts. And he goes, this is who I was, this is how I met Jesus, and this is who I've become as a result of it. Now, Paul isn't able to get to the end of his testimony, because as soon as the crowd heard that Jesus saved him, so that he could go and tell the whole world, the Gentile world, that the Messiah had come, not just for the Jews, but for everybody. I mean, the crowd went nuts. Basically, he's like, he's given a John 3:16 message. Like, God so loved the world, he gave his one and only son, that anybody who believes in him, this is kind of the message he's going. He goes, and I am living that message out. I am going to the whole world and telling them that the Messiah has come and that they can be saved by their faith in him. Well, again, the crowd goes nuts when they hear this. And it makes sense, right? I mean, the reason he's in this trouble is because they thought he brought a Gentile into the temple. And now he's telling them the Messiah the long-awaited Jewish Messiah has come also to save the Jews, or the Gentiles. So the crowd starts calling for his death once again. Remember, they tried to kill him. Now they're calling for his death once again. And it's interesting. In the same place where Jesus stood and the crowds are saying, crucify him, crucify him, Paul is standing in the same spot and the crowds are yelling, kill him, kill him. He doesn't deserve to live. Well, once again, the Roman soldiers intervene and they save Paul. But they plan to interrogate Paul the hard way. To find out, why is this guy causing so much trouble? They want Paul to spill the beans. And so they stretch him out and they're ready to flog him, whip him. Again, This is probably the same spot where Jesus was flogged. But Paul, if you think about it, up to he hasn't like Jesus. He hasn't done anything wrong. He's innocent of all these claims. He's done nothing to deserve this. Now, fortunately for Paul, he is spared of this brutal flogging because of his Roman citizenship. Other times in his life, he's not spared, but he's spared now. So the next day, after all this craziness, he appears before the Sanhedrin, which is the Jewish ruling council. Again, this is the same group Jesus appeared before. Now, you've noticed there's a lot of similarities between what Paul was experiencing in Jerusalem and what Jesus experienced in Jerusalem. And that makes sense because as you follow Jesus closely in the center of God's will, you're going to have a lot of kind of experiences that Jesus had, right? As you stand next to Jesus, things that happen to him are going to happen to you. Certainly first century Jerusalem, that's the story. So Paul appears before the Sanhedrin, and now he gets a chance to speak a second time. Remember the first time to the crowds, he got going, but then he got shut down. So he starts off a second speech by stating his belief in the resurrection, that he believes Jesus had died and was raised from the dead. But before he can get into the second sentence, an argument breaks out. The situation gets very escalated and it becomes violent. The crowd is so enraged with Paul that he is literally about to be torn limb from limb. You can imagine him in the crowd and people just really trying to rip him apart with their bare hands. So he's once more rescued at the last moment by Roman soldiers. And the text says they really had to wrestle him away from out of the grip of those who wanted to kill him. And they finally drag him into the soldiers' barracks for his own safety. Well, say what you will about Paul. His testimony and his words were very powerful. He didn't win over anyone here, but he did remain faithful to his call. He's staying in the center of God's will, and he's exposing people to the truth and the power of Jesus Christ. That's what God sent him there for. That's what he was doing. And whenever he says something like that, it's going to cause a stir one way or another. And in worship, I'm going to have Steve Reuter share this in person. But for now, I will share this on his behalf, because just like Paul, who used an opportunity to speak the truth about Jesus and who Jesus was and to give his testimony, Steve Reuter, who's a member of our church and who came to faith in Christ recently, had a similar experience. Now, Steve wasn't being torn apart, but he had an opportunity to share his faith. He felt a prompting by God to do that, to say, hey, this is who I was, this is how I met Jesus, this is a difference it's made in my life, and kind of giving an encouragement to follow to somebody else. And it ended up having a wonderful impact, and not just with that person, with other people. And I'm just so proud of Steve. Just as we would be proud of Paul for kind of being willing to step into the fray and saying, this is who Jesus is, and being faithful to that calling to being a witness. And just what an encouragement for us to, if we want to be in the center of God's will, we're going to be a witness, we're going to be faithful, we're going to be sharing who Jesus is, whether it's, a comfortable or uncomfortable situation. So anyway, let's get back to Paul. Let me just ask you, how do you think it was going so far for him? So his time in Jerusalem, it's filled with turmoil, with misunderstanding, and with violence. He's tried to talk about Jesus, but both times he did, he was shut down. He's striking out at every turn. And now he's in chains. And honestly, he kind of has nothing to show for it. He hasn't really done any good. Now, from a human perspective, we would say this time in Jerusalem has been a total disaster, right? It's like the world's worst mission trip. You didn't convert anybody. You got beat up. You had to get rescued multiple times. And now you're in jail. All right? So from a human perspective, it's a disaster. But let me ask you, what about from a divine perspective? Was it a disaster? Had Paul failed the Lord? No, not at all. God had called Paul to go to Jerusalem and to testify about him. And Paul was faithful to do that very thing, despite the fierce opposition. And I would say, from God's point of view, the trip was a success. Paul did what God asked him to do. And through it all, he remains at the center of God's will. Now, there's a bit of evidence for this because we see that at the end of kind of Paul's stay in Jerusalem in Acts 23, verse 11, it says this: "The following night, after all the trouble, the Lord stood by him and said, 'Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome.'" What a beautiful image here. Jesus visits him. The resurrected Jesus visits him and stands by him. You know, nobody else stood up for Paul when all this junk was going on in Jerusalem. But Jesus comes and he stands by him, and he comes to strengthen him and encourage him with words of assurance. And kind of the image I have here is a manager coming out to the pitcher's mound to talk to a pitcher who was weary and tired and maybe losing some confidence. And that's Paul. And Jesus' message is this: I've got you. Keep going. I'm here with you. I told you this was going to happen, and you came anyway, and I am pleased and I am delighted in you, and I want you to keep going. And just as you talked about me here, I've got another mission for you. I'm going to send you to Rome, to the heart of the empire, to bring this gospel message. And for the rest of Acts, we will be reading about that journey. Paul does get to Rome. But before he leaves Jerusalem, it's worth noting in Acts chapter 23, by God's providence, Paul manages to escape from one more near-death experience. There's this big conspiracy to kill him, to arrange a fake meeting and to kind of kill him on the way. And so, taking all of Paul's experiences in Jerusalem into account, I want us to go back to that original question. What does it mean that the safest place to be is in the center of God's will? I mean, is it true? Or is it just a trite cliche that falls apart when we take an honest look at life? When we think about Paul and his time in Jerusalem, like, it can be really confusing, right? Because on the one hand, God brought him face to face with danger, and he was beaten and stuff. Well, that doesn't seem very safe. But on the other hand, he is rescued 4 different times at just the last moment, kind of a last moment intervention. So it does seem like, okay, well, it is safe. Like, God is protecting him. But God protects him so he can go to Rome. But when he gets there, he'll preach the gospel, and he will eventually end up with his head on a Roman chopping block. All for being faithful to Jesus. So, what do we mean? I'd say, what does Corrie ten Boom mean when she says the safest place to be is in the center of God's will? And I think both Paul and Corrie's experience prove that safety, like true safety, what she was getting at, isn't about being free from harm or danger or suffering in a physical sense. It's something much more than that, something much deeper. And it's something I can share that our family worked through very, very personally. And I would just like to end with our experience. So as many of you know, I was a chaplain in Iraq. And I was in a combat zone that saw a lot of action. And I felt called to the military, and knowing that I would be deployed and knowing that it was likely I was going to be put in harm's way. And Susan felt the same call too. And so then when I was gone, Susan was praying for me for safety, obviously. She was praying for safety. But in time, that became for her something not just like, God, don't let him get hurt. Because for her, safety became something much more. Safety wasn't, again, about whether I made it home or not. Safety was, I was in God's hands. He had control of my life. He was with me. He would sustain me. He had me. I was in his grip of grace, whether it was here on earth or in eternity. Like, God had me. And that is like, it wasn't just confined to like this life and this world. It was this eternal perspective that I was safe in the Lord's hands. And then that gave her great peace. Like, John is safe. Like, he's always going to be safe. And then she then kind of moved that back on herself by saying, if John doesn't come home, then, and I have to face the reality and the challenges of that, like, I'm also going to be safe because God, I'm in the center of God's will too. Like, I'm in his hands. I'm in his grip of grace. Like, he's got this all figured out. I'll never be let go or be on my own. And I think that's what Corrie ten Boom was getting at. That being safe in the center of God's will is about being where God wants you to be. That your life is aligned with his purposes and his guidance. And I think that's where we find that our soul is most secure and at peace. It's this assurance that we are in his hands. And I think that that has universal application to us, because it's not just if you're a first century, missionary in Jerusalem, or you're rescuing Jews from the Nazis, or you're in Iraq in a combat zone. It's for all the hardships. It's for all the difficulties. It's for all the ups and downs we face through life. We're safe as we walk with Jesus, as we participate in his will, as we do the things that he calls us to do, knowing that we are in the grip of his grace and in his love, and that is, in the end, the safest place of all.